All right, good morning, everybody. My name is Rachel Scheinerman. This is My Jewish Learning's Daf Yomi Week in Review. Happy Purim edition. Happy Purim to all who are celebrating. We are joined this week by Professor Sarah Ronis, and we have a lot to talk about. So, Professor Ronis, I'm going to just pass it right on over to you.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And I want to wish everybody a happy Purim. I'm not going to wear this for the whole time, but I thought we could start off on a little bit of a festive note. So I see some folks already saying hello and telling us where you are from in the chat. I want to start, actually, this is our first full week in Yevamot. Our first full week even in Seder Nashim. So what I'd love to do is I want to hear from you in the chat. What did you think of your first full week in this very complicated tractate?
We're getting some feelings in the chat already, not surprisingly. This was a tough week, folks.
Yeah, I'm seeing ew, ugh, hating it. Oy vey. Confusing.
Yep, it's hard to.
Everything was simple compared to this. Oh my goodness, you are so right. Nightmares. Some folks wanting to give up. Oh, interesting. We've got a couple of folks saying that they feel like this really resonates with them in terms of the family dynamics being really complicated here, right? I think sometimes we talk about, oh, you know, families back then were less complicated. Not at all.
Nope.
Yep. Yeah, I'm perfecting the art of rapid skimming. Oof. I hear you. So I want to just name all of those feelings, both the people who are resonating with parts of this and the people who are really struggling with parts of this. And I want us to bring this into the next 25 minutes that we're going to have together, and I'll be honest, into the rest of Nashim, not just Yevamot, but Nashim. I'm gonna resonate with everything that you all just said and say that this week's readings had a lot of tension for me. On the one hand, some really incredible theoretical debates about how we derive halakha from the Torah and when positive mitzvot override negative mitzvot. And on the other hand, reading these texts, thinking about the impacts of those theoretical debates on actual people with actual bodies. I really struggled with the ways that this whole week's stop beam addressed sexual assault from a theoretical perspective. Right? I mean, this isn't theoretical, given that according to the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, 1 out of every 5 American women will experience a sexual assault in their lifetime, and 3% of men. And so, you know, this isn't just theory. For a lot of us who are reading the Talmud, and many of you have emailed me and shared things about this, right? This is really a lived experience. So I'm going to spend the first part of our time together thinking about the theoretical debates about how we derive halakha, and I'm going to spend the second part thinking about the ways that the daf describes assault. And if you want to be here for the first half and then tap out, you should absolutely feel free to do that. And if this week's daf challenged you in ways that were physically or psychologically unhealthy, I want to encourage you to reach out and ask for support. I'm going to put a link in the chat. This is a link to the to RAIN's National Sexual Assault Telephone Hotline. And if this journey through the daf is more than is psychologically healthy for you, I want to encourage you to reach out and ask for support. So we're going to start, though, with the theory stuff. The Gemara this week is still talking about the Mishnah that opens Yevamot, right? The Mishnah, just as a reminder, says that there are 15 categories of women who exempt their co-wives from Yibum and from Chalitza, if they were married at the time of the man's death. But if they'd already died, or if they'd refused the marriage, or if they were divorced, or if they were found to be an Ilonit, then their co-wives are required to do Yibum or Chalitza. And if you're still wondering what an Ilonit is, hold on for 2 more days, and then we have a whole piece about it. So that's the Mishnah, just as a reminder, because we're still in the first Mishnah of Yevamot this whole week. So last week's Gemara on last Thursday on 3b, the Gemara starts to ask, how do we know that you actually are prohibited from marrying your sister-in-law, right? Why does a positive mitzvah not override a negative, right? Why do we have right? Why would the requirement to Yibum not override the prohibition to marry against marrying 2 sisters, right? And so the whole first half of this week's daf is really trying to understand where we get the idea that you can't marry your sister-in-law when it comes to Yibum. And the idea, right, they say, well, there's this principle, a positive mitzvah does override a negative prohibition sometimes. So like, where's this coming from? So then they start wondering, does that principle apply in the case of Yibum? And they walk us through a whole bunch of potential examples to show us, oh, maybe it does override it. Maybe you can marry your sister-in-law. Right, so what about if we can we learn it from shatnez and tzitzit, right? Mixing linen and wool in the case of a garment with 4 corners that has the strings attached. Well, probably not. Well, can we learn it from Nazir, right? Does the fact that a leprous Nazir have to shave his head show that the positive mitzvah of shaving your head after an experience of tzara'at override the negative obligation for a Nazir not to shave his head? Well, but he doesn't have to stay a Nazir, right? So, that's probably not a great example. But okay, maybe a positive prohibition does override, a positive mitzvah does override a negative mitzvah, but not one that is liable to karet, to rabbinic excision. So can we learn this principle from other things relating to circumcision? Maybe the Paschal lamb, maybe the daily offering, maybe, I don't know, something else. Now, the Gemara rejects all of these possibilities, as well as, and I sort of loved this, well, maybe if one of them isn't strong enough, more of them are, right? If we just combine a bunch of different examples. But they end up saying not so much. So then how do we know that a man can't marry his sister-in-law, right? That's sort of where we end up. They run through all of these examples to think about, can we learn that can we learn from some other case that you actually might be able to marry your sister-in-law if she's married to right? If your brother is married to somebody and you are married to his wife's sister already. And if your head is spinning, I mean, this is one of those tractates where I want to strongly encourage you to make a lot of charts. And actually there are books out there that have charts of Yevamot. So, right, like you are not the first person to think, gosh, I probably need a chart for this. So they run through even more examples. Oh, wonderful, thank you. Rabbi Richard Prass says that the Steinsaltz Talmud on this has some wonderful charts, and I want to just name that, right? There are also books in Hebrew that are just charts, so you can get a book with just the charts of this if Hebrew is a language you're comfortable in. But Steinsaltz is a wonderful English example. Thank you for bringing that. So we get through all of this debate about how we learn that a positive mitzvah overrides a negative prohibition. And then the conclusion on page 8, right, we're already 5 pages into the week. The conclusion on page 8 is actually here, a positive mitzvah doesn't override a prohibition that includes karet. That if a prohibition is serious enough that it would lead to the punishment of karet, which is excision, the fancy word, excision, then it doesn't override it. So you don't marry your sister-in-law if, right, you cannot marry two sisters, even in the case of yibum. So ultimately, since that seems now obvious, right, you can't marry two sisters, now we get to the rabbi saying, okay, so the Mishnah and the verse in Leviticus is really coming to teach us that she even exempts her co-wives. And I see some great discussion in the chat about what on earth we call those co-wives. And I think, two things are both true. One, the probably more neutral term is co-wife. And two, the fact that the Hebrew word for this in the Aramaic is sarah, or rival, or even pain, right? If you know the Yiddish word tsuris, it's related to the word for co-wife, tells us that even linguistically, they kind of knew that polygamy was not super healthy, right? I mean, you don't call your co-wife tsuris if you think it's, a wonderful thing with no level of complexity. So from there, okay, so that's how we get to, can you marry your sister-in-law? Well, how can you marry your wife's sister? Conclusion, no. And you also can't marry anybody who she is co-wives with. All right. Then on Daf 9, we get to a new discussion about the Mishnah's list of the 15. Before we get there, I want to stop and see if we have a couple of questions about all of the derivations, right? We're going to talk about the marriage piece, but first I want to talk about any questions about any of the, how we learn Talmud? How do we learn halakha from the Torah according to this discussion?
Is any of this relevant today? Do we do chalitza today?
So this is actually a really interesting thing, because I've seen a lot of people in various Facebook groups feel like, oh, but it's all theoretical. And it's not, actually. Today, yibum is not practiced in most circles, but if in traditional Jewish communities, if a man dies and his wife, with a brother and his wife, and they have no children, then actually they do chalitza. And what that means, by the way, is much like in the case of the complexities of Jewish divorce, there can be real problems if one of the parties isn't interested in doing chalitza. Right? This actually is live in a way that I think some people, not the yibum part. The yibum part is not live, but the chalitza part, in order to be able to marry somebody else, actually is. It's usually done in like a rabbi's office, but yeah. How much of this is about inheritance? That's a wonderful question. And it's a wonderful question, I think, actually, in two ways, right? So on the one hand, it is about inheritance in that they want the deceased brother to have an inheritance, right? To both to inherit a name and a legacy, and also stuff. And on the other hand, it's about inheritance, because if you're wondering, in a polygamous society, why would somebody say no? Well, inheritance is percentage. So if there are 3 brothers, and each of them, let's say there are no sisters, we're not going to get into complicated math. Let's say there are 3 brothers, each of them gets a third, except that the eldest gets 2 portions. So it's really half, and we'll talk about that at some other point. So, but if one of them is deceased, then everybody else gets a half. So, right, if one is deceased and has no children, then the percentages shift. So it's also about inheritance, because if they don't do yibum, they all get more. Does that make sense? Okay. I mean, this is all complicated, right? Absolutely. So I see a lot of people asking about Rachel and Leah, and we're actually going to talk about that in about a week. So stay tuned for Rachel and Leah, because that's going to get even more complicated. I'm just going to say, whatever question you ask, it's going to get more complicated. We're only in the first week. I also see somebody say, could a woman refuse? Yes, you can say no to, right? You can perform chalitza whether or not the man has boils, right? You can say no for any reason. Absolutely. Okay, let's move on to the second half, because I think that's where you're all going to have the most to talk about, and I really want to leave that space. So, oh, Laura, that's a wonderful question. What happens to a widow who performs chalitza? Where does she live, and who is her family? Yeah, and I think, you know, we say she can say no for any reason, and that's true, but then what are the consequences of that? So if her parents are alive, she could move back in with them. If they aren't, and her husband is deceased, and she doesn't inherit a huge amount because they don't have children, it gets pretty complicated, in that it's not clear where she goes and who supports her. And so, yeah, I think when I say, you know, she can say no, you know, economically, it's not clear how many women would have had that option. Now, if she has daughters, she is completely unable to do yibum. Daughters count for passing on the name. Okay, so
can I interject? Sorry, I don't usually,
but
I think it's also helpful to have the two biblical examples of this in mind, Judah and Tamar and Ruth. And so Ruth is the example where they do chalitza, and she does it so she can marry somebody else, right? That's an example why someone might want to do chalitza. She wants to marry Boaz, but he's not the nearest kinsman. So that would be an example of why you might, in the ancient world, want to do that, and still, because she does have backup protection, as it were.
Yes. And I do want to say, because I think a lot of folks are probably thinking about Ruth in this case, the Torah's version of yibum says that it keeps sort of spiraling to the next nearest relative if one man says no. The Gemara insists it's only brothers, right? So it's only your immediate family, and if there is no immediate family, then we don't do it. So they already have constrained yibum as a mechanism. Okay, and then we get to Daf 9, where we get back to the Mishnah's list of 15, and our nudnik, Rabbi Levi, asking why it isn't really 16. Right? What about other kinds of family configurations that aren't named? And this gets the Gemara back to the question of sexual assault, and it poses a bunch of different scenarios of inter-family sexual assault and asking about them. And here I want to say, because, you know, I'm hearing a lot of, you know, as we're going through this, oh, well, it's just theoretical, it's not endorsing it, it's just describing the effects of it. And I want to say I agree. I don't think the Gemara is endorsing sexual assault. I want to be very clear about that. But it also isn't just theoretical. So to give you just some other data, 34% of children and teens in the United States who've experienced sexual assault, 34% of those were perpetrated by family members. 3/4 of all sexual assaults in the United States are committed by somebody the survivor knows. And that includes family, in-laws, and friends. So it's not just theoretical. It just isn't. And in a world where men and women are studying the daf, and we are bringing our own lives to the daf, we are very aware of that in our own bodies. So I read this incredibly sad for the women whose stories are not the focus of the rabbi's discussion, but just food for their thinking. Especially because while I genuinely think that the rabbis think that sexual assault is bad, let me be very clear about that. Sexual assault is bad according to the rabbis. But they don't feel the need to say that in this discussion, right? We never actually get that sentence here. And I am telling you that because I know lots of other parts of the Talmud. But as we're moving through this together, and for some of us, it might be our first time, we don't get that sentence here. And so their legal thinking, which I genuinely love most of the time, right? Huge nerd for Talmud. Here it reads as callous to me and disconnected from the lived realities of their world, and perhaps even some of the complex family dynamics of the rabbis themselves. But I want to end with something because I was thinking about this as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about today, which is that today's daf also points out the incredibly real consequences of assault for yibum. Because if you do it when you are prohibited from doing it, then there are real halachic stakes in this world and with karet even in the world to come. And what that means is that you have to believe people when they tell you what happened to them. And you have to create the kind of space and the kind of relationships and trust where they would be comfortable telling you. And I think that is something I can take from this week's daf and say, okay, if there are real halachic stakes, how do we create a community where people will tell you what happened to them and know that you are trusting or trustworthy to say this, to listen. So we have another, that's sort of my thinking about this, right? I wanted to make sure we could actually take something helpful from this in our own lives. But I want to hear from you. What are your thinking about these texts? I saw a hand, but I didn't see whose it was. Rachel, do you see whose hand it is and maybe can unmute them? No? Okay. Well, we'll keep going then. That's okay. So I'm seeing some back and forth. Should we say it? Should we not in the daf? And I think, that's a great question, right? I don't have control over it.
It just got unmuted.
Oh, wonderful.
Okay. I'll throw in one. I have my own answer to this, but I think it's great to hear other perspective. I love how you're applying the pages to contemporary issues of sexual assault and rape. So I think that's one answer. My other answer is in these 10 pages that are so not our world. How do you, as someone who's passionate about Talmud, continue with daf and draw wisdom? So you already gave us one, I think, answer, which I think is great. And yes, I agree. And for other esoteric pages after pages.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, I also want to hear from you all, right? Those of you who said, I want to quit, but then you came today, right? And what I would say is, I think we can, for those of us who are Jewish and who see whose lives are shaped by 2,000 years of this oral tradition, to understand where we came from, I think is really important. And to engage with the rabbis is really important. And one of the things that you've all already seen, right? So we're building on what you've already seen in Moed. The Gemara is very happy to talk about when rabbis mess up. Because the point isn't to make our past saints, right? I teach at a Catholic university, right? That we do a lot of talk about saints, right? Literally, it's St. Mary's University. And this isn't a book of saints. This is a book of wisdom we're supposed to learn from. And that means that sometimes even the Gemara tells us when rabbis don't live up to expectations. And I think we can be part of the process of recognizing that too. Janine, your point is so true. Janine says, we were never supposed to see this. And I want to be clear, it's not just, right? It's not just, so we haven't gotten there yet, but we will. There is a strong tradition of women of women not being allowed to study Talmud. And I think we are, right? This is a world where they actually aren't imagining women participating. And how exciting is it that we can do things that the rabbis couldn't even imagine? But there are consequences of that, because when you're eavesdropping in a conversation that isn't actually for you, you're going to hear things you don't like. Now, on the other hand, if we know that there are more people around the table, that's going to change the conversations we have, I think, for the better. Now, Dita, I love your point. Perhaps this teaches something about retrojecting a modern sensibility onto the past. You know, I think that's certainly true when we're retrojecting, well, not retrojecting, but when we're saying, how would women have experienced this? But I actually don't know that it's a modern sensibility. And what I mean by that is the texts that we have, right, the Gemara is written by men and rabbis who, just let me say it again, did not think sexual assault was acceptable. But I also bet if we had asked women in the ancient world, enslaved people in the ancient world, people who were more likely to have been the survivors of sexual assault, they would have told you it was unacceptable back then. And they would have been pretty unhappy thinking about it callously. And we don't have their voices. So it's hard for us to necessarily know that. But I think sometimes we always want to be careful not to assume that the entire ancient world is recorded in these texts that were written by largely pretty elite men. Yeah. And I think they would have been less likely to have experienced this as survivors or victims. And so that would have shaped the kinds of conversations that they were having. But, you know, I'm guessing over the cooking pot, women and enslaved people were having different kinds of conversations. Yeah. And I also appreciate those in the chat who are saying, let's not, you know, judge too strongly, because the modern world still has its own problems, right? All of the statistics that I gave you were from the modern world. So I want to end. Do we have maybe one more comment? Because this is a rough one, and I know that. Oh, I love that. Yes, that would be a great modern exercise. Write the Talmud according to women and folks around the cooking pot. Yes. Tell us why to continue. Oh, what a fantastic question, and what a wonderful place for us to end. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in the chat again the information from RAIN for their hotline. Now, what I want to say, if this is psychologically unhealthy for you, you don't have to continue. You do not have to continue. You can stop and then join us again next time around. So I want to, if you're sort of on the fence, I'm going to give you some ideas about why to continue. If this is genuinely bringing up trauma in ways that you know are unhealthy, don't. That's my, but there's plenty more Talmud to come. You can rejoin us. But if you are sort of thinking about, what do I get out of this? I think a lot of things. First, I think we get a better sense of the rabbis' ways of thinking about the world, and especially all of those complicated gray areas where the law isn't clear. And I think there is real value in that. I think we're going to learn a lot about how the rabbis think about bodies and gender and sex that are going to be really exciting and really relevant to some modern discussions that we have about those exact issues. Different configurations of marriage that are going to be helpful examples for us to think about. And I think there's value in that. And I also think, as you've seen, and My Jewish Learning does such a great job of this, there's, even in these complicated pages, there are always these gems, these things to sort of inspire, challenge, make us struggle with. And if you're somebody who wants to and can healthily engage with that fullness of Gemara, you're going to find those pieces in this in a way which can be really exciting and challenging and give you the expertise to know next DAF cycle what you want to do and what you don't. But again, not everybody needs to continue with this, and that's okay too. Because as several of you have pointed out, this text wasn't always written for everybody in this room. And sometimes when you are eavesdropping, you hear things that are really, really difficult and maybe better not to hear. And that's totally okay as well. So I would wish everybody a happy Purim, a freilichen Purim, Chag Purim Sameach. I hope everybody whose custom it is has some kind of really delicious hamantashen today. And I will see you through the daf.
Thank you so much, Professor Onis, for tackling such a complicated and difficult set of pages with us. Yeah, the Talmud is hard, but I find it's always helpful to remember that they didn't think you had to agree with everything. They didn't agree with each other, and we don't have to always agree with them. That is not the point of Talmud, I think. At least for me, I think the point is discussion and struggle. And so we shall struggle through, because this is commonly recognized as one of the most difficult tractates. And we are, what, 12 pages down? How many are we down, folks? What's
10.
today?
Today is 10.
We're only 10. Okay. Yeah. Well, we've got about 112 to go then. So we will see you all tomorrow and next week. And thank you again, Professor Ronis. Thank you all of you for being such engaged learners and exciting study partners for us. And happy Purim. Okay, bye everyone.